20 missed calls. 20 times I watched my phone screen blink in the freezing silence of the hospital corridor, only to die without a single answer. My father was behind those heavy double doors, his chest opened, a team of surgeons fighting for his life, while my fiancée, Elena, was miles away, hanging fairy lights for another man's birthday party. The sterile smell of antiseptic burned my throat as I stared at the dark screen, my thumb hovering over the dial key for the 21st time, knowing she would only slide the red bar to ignore me again. She had promised to be by my side during this surgery, but when Sebastian called crying about a minor issue with his caterer, she didn't hesitate for a second. She left me in the shadow of the operating room, alone with the cold hum of the vending machines and the terrifying silence of my own fading hope. I sat on the hard plastic chair, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the phone, listening to the distant, muffled sounds of hospital staff talking in hushed tones, realizing that the woman who wore my engagement ring had completely shut me out of her world when I needed her the most. The red light above the operating room door glowed like a mocking eye, a constant reminder that time was slipping away while my father's heart sat in the hands of strangers. Every minute felt like an eternity, and with every passing second, the anger inside me began to harden into something cold and permanent. I looked down at my hands, covered in grease from the logistics warehouse where I worked double shifts, all to pay for the extravagant wedding Elena insisted we needed. Sebastian had mocked my budget-conscious choices behind my back, calling me cheap, and Elena had merely laughed, telling me to stop being so sensitive. Now, while my father lay on a metal table, she was likely laughing at Sebastian's jokes, pouring champagne, and ensuring the spotlight remained firmly on her childhood best friend. The injustice of it clawed at my chest, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe in the sterile, air-conditioned air. I wanted to scream, to run out of the building and force her to look at what she was doing to us, but I couldn't leave my mother, who sat next to me, silently weeping into her hands. My mother, Margaret, was a proud woman, but tonight she looked small, broken by the suddenness of my father's heart attack and the cruel realization of who my fiancé really was. She had quietly disapproved of Elena's self-centered nature for 3 long years, warning me that a woman who cannot prioritize her own partner would never make a reliable wife. I had defended Elena back then, blaming her childhood bond with Sebastian, making excuses for every cancelled date and every broken promise. But looking at my mother's tear-stained face and her trembling shoulders, the excuses I had built up over the years began to crumble like wet sand. There was no defense for this level of cruelty, no justification for choosing a birthday party over a dying man's family. I put my arm around my mother's shoulders, feeling her shake with silent sobs, and in that moment, the last trace of my patience snapped. I took my phone, silenced the ringer, and placed it face down on the empty chair beside me, deciding that I would no longer beg for the attention of someone who treated my family's pain as a mere annoyance. The silence that followed was heavy, a suffocating blanket that filled the corridor as the hours dragged on toward midnight. I stared at the floor, watching the reflection of the fluorescent lights on the polished linoleum, my mind spinning with 3 years of accumulated compromises. How had I let myself become so small in my own relationship, constantly stepping aside to accommodate Sebastian's endless drama? I had spent my savings, worked until my bones ached, and ignored the warnings of everyone who cared about me, all to build a life with a woman who couldn't even answer a phone call in a crisis. The realization was a bitter pill, but as the hours ticked by, the bitterness turned into a strange, quiet clarity. When the double doors finally pushed open and the lead surgeon walked out, his face pale and exhausted, my heart stopped. He pulled off his mask, looked at me and my mother, and took a deep breath, and I knew that whatever he was about to say, my life had already changed forever, and there was no going back to the man I used to be. For 3 long years, I lived in the shadow of a man I barely knew, a man who seemed to exist solely to consume the air in my relationship. Sebastian was Elena's childhood best friend, a relationship she treated as a sacred bond that superseded any commitment she made to me. Every anniversary, every birthday, and every quiet weekend we planned was inevitably interrupted by Sebastian's minor, manufactured emergencies. If his car broke down, Elena would leave our dinner table to pick him up. If he had a fight with his current partner, Elena would spend hours on the phone comforting him, leaving me sitting alone in our apartment. I was expected to understand, to be the mature one, the quiet logistics manager who didn't cause drama. If I dared to speak up, Elena would immediately defensive, accusing me of being jealous of a friendship that predated our relationship. "He's like a brother to me, Liam," she would shout, her eyes flashing with anger, as if that justified making me feel like a stranger in my own life. I remembered our 2nd anniversary, a rainy night when I had booked a table at a quiet restaurant across town, a place we had wanted to visit for months. I had saved for weeks to afford the meal, wanting to make the night special for Elena, to remind her of the love we shared before Sebastian's shadow grew so large. Halfway through the main course, Elena's phone had buzzed on the table, and my heart had sunk at the sight of Sebastian's name on the screen. She didn't even hesitate before answering, her voice filled with privacy as she listened to him complain about a minor leak in his kitchen ceiling. Without looking at me, she began to gather her coat, apologizing quickly and promising she would be right back after she helped him turn off the main water valve. I sat in that restaurant for 2 hours, watching the candles burn down and the food turn cold, before I paid the massive bill and walked home in the pouring rain. When she finally returned at dawn, she didn't apologize, she simply complained about how stressful Sebastian's night had been, as if my night had been a luxury. The wedding planning had been the ultimate test of my patience, a long, exhausting battle where my voice was consistently drowned out by Elena's extravagant demands. She insisted on booking the Grand Horizon, an elite, high-end venue on the edge of the metropolitan area, a place that cost more than my annual salary. When I tried to discuss a more sensible budget, Sebastian had laughed at me during a dinner party, calling me a budget husband who couldn't provide for a woman like Elena. Elena had smiled at the comment, telling me later that Sebastian was just joking and that we needed to make a statement with our wedding venue. To make her happy, to prove that I could be the man she wanted, I took on a second job at the logistics warehouse, working 12-hour shifts until my muscles ached and my eyes burned with exhaustion. Sebastian, meanwhile, didn't contribute a single cent, yet he was the one Elena consulted on every decision, from the floral arrangements to the menu, leaving me to feel like a mere ATM for their dream event. As I worked those long night shifts, surrounded by the cold steel of the shipping containers and the loud rumble of forklifts, I began to realize how much of myself I had sacrificed. I had stopped seeing my own friends, stopped visiting my parents on weekends, and abandoned my hobbies, all to keep up with Elena's demands and Sebastian's social schedule. I was running on empty, fueled only by the belief that once we were married, things would finally change and she would finally focus on us. My father, Arthur, had pulled me aside a month ago, his face lined with worry as he looked at my hollow cheeks and tired eyes, begging me to reconsider. A marriage built on one-sided sacrifice is a cage, Liam, he had said softly, his hand resting on my shoulder, a warning I had brushed off because I was too proud to admit he was right. Now, sitting in the cold hospital corridor, his words echoed in my mind like a bell, a painful reminder of the price I had paid for a love that was never truly mine. At the Grand Horizon venue, now decorated with hundreds of fairy lights and silver balloons, the party was in full swing. Sebastian stood on a small stage, holding a glass of expensive champagne, his red hair shining under the spotlights as he smiled down at the crowd of friends. Elena stood near the front, clapping enthusiastically, her face bright with pride as she looked up at her childhood best friend. She had spent the last 3 days decorating this room, spending her own savings and even using a portion of our wedding budget to ensure Sebastian's 27th birthday was perfect. When her phone vibrated in her designer handbag, she pulled it out, frowned at my name on the screen, and quickly silenced it before sliding it back into her bag. She muttered to her friend standing nearby that I was probably just nagging her about the wedding invitations or complaining about the cost of the centerpieces. Liam always finds a way to ruin the mood, she whispered, her voice tight with annoyance, completely unaware that my father's heart had stopped only hours before. Sebastian tapped his glass with a silver spoon, silencing the chatter in the room, and cleared his throat to make his speech. He looked directly at Elena, his brown eyes gleaming with a mixture of affection and triumph, and raised his glass in her direction. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, but most of all, I want to thank Elena," he said, his voice loud and clear through the microphone. "Without her, none of this would be possible. She's been my number one since we were kids, and no matter what changes in our lives, she's the one person I can always count on to put me first." The crowd cheered, and Elena beamed, raising her glass in return, her heart swelling with the validation she had chased for years. She ignored the slight pang of guilt that came with ignoring my calls, convincing herself that she would make it up to me tomorrow, that my father's health issues were probably exaggerated anyway. She was too wrapped up in the glamour of the night, too addicted to the praise of Sebastian's wealthy friends, to realize she was standing on the edge of a cliff. It was during the toast that Victor, Sebastian's wealthy manager and the man who funded most of his social projects, walked over to the bar where I had stood only a week before. Victor was a cold, calculating man who had always looked down on my quiet lifestyle and my warehouse job, viewing me as an obstacle to Sebastian's social circle. He had cornered me in the parking lot after a dinner party a month ago, his voice low and threatening as he offered me a check to walk away from Elena. "She belongs in a world of success, Liam, not in a drafty apartment with a logistics manager," Victor had whispered, his eyes dark with contempt, warning me that if I didn't cancel the wedding, he would make sure my career in the city was ruined. I had kept that threat a secret from Elena, wanting to protect her from Victor's malice and hoping she would choose me over their toxic social circle. But now, watching her laugh with Victor on the party livestream that a friend had sent me, I realized how foolish I had been to stay quiet. Elena's phone vibrated again, the 20-second call from my number, but she didn't even look at it this time, handing her bag to Sebastian's assistant to avoid the distraction. She danced, drank, and laughed, basking in the attention of a room full of people who didn't care about her, while the man who had worked double shifts for her sat in a dark hospital room. Sebastian laughed as he whispered something in her ear, gesturing toward the door, and she nodded, completely detached from the reality of the vows she had promised to take. The music was loud, a throbbing beat that seemed to match the pounding in my head as I watched the live video on my screen from the hospital corridor. I saw her clink glasses with Sebastian, saw the bright smile on her face, and felt a cold wave of indifference wash over me. The pain was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow silence that made me realize I no longer cared where she went or who she danced with. She had made her choice, and as the party continued into the night, I made mine, preparing to close the door on a chapter of my life that had cost me far too much. The double doors of the operating room swung open with a dull thud, and the lead surgeon walked out, pulling down his blue mask with a tired sigh. I stood up immediately, my heart hammering against my ribs as I looked at his exhausted eyes, searching for any sign of hope. My mother gripped my arm, her fingers digged into my skin, her breath catching in her throat as she waited for the verdict that would decide our future. He made it through the surgery, the doctor said, his voice soft but clear in the quiet corridor, though his face remained serious. But the damage to his heart is severe. He faces a long, difficult recovery, and he will need constant care and a completely stress-free environment if he is to survive the next few months. Relief washed over me, so strong that my knees trembled, and I held my mother as she wept tears of gratitude against my chest. But as the doctor explained the details of the recovery plan, the reality of my situation settled in, cold and clear. I looked down at my phone, which had remained completely silent for the last 4 hours since Elena had silenced my calls. There were no messages, no texts asking if my father was okay, no signs that the woman who was supposed to be my wife cared if my family survived the night. I opened my call log, staring at the 21 red entries, each one a testament to my willingness to beg for her support, and felt a profound sense of disgust. I had worked myself to the bone, ignored my own father's advice, and sacrificed my self-respect, all for a woman who couldn't even leave a party to stand with me in a hospital corridor. I looked at my mother, who was now talking to the nurse about visiting hours, her eyes red and tired but filled with a quiet strength. I knew then that I couldn't bring Elena into my father's recovery, her drama, her selfishness, and Sebastian's constant presence would kill him faster than any heart condition. With a calm, steady hand, I dialed the number of the Grand Horizon wedding venue, the expensive hall that had cost me my savings and my health. The night manager answered on the third ring, his voice professional and polite despite the late hour. "I want to cancel the wedding booking for next month," I said, my voice steady, devoid of any emotion, ignoring his questions about the non-refundable cancellation fee. "Yes, I understand the deposit is lost. Cancel it immediately." Next, I opened the group chat that contained all 80 of our wedding guests, friends, family, and Elena's social circle, and began to type. "The wedding between Liam and Elena is cancelled. The ceremony will not take place. Please do not send any gifts or make travel arrangements. Have a nice day." I pressed send, watching the message deliver to dozens of phones simultaneously, and felt a massive weight lift from my shoulders. I took the engagement ring key from my pocket, the key to the apartment we shared, and placed it on the plastic chair next to my phone. I didn't feel angry anymore, I felt nothing but a quiet, clean emptiness, the realization that my 3-year prison sentence had finally ended. I looked at the operating room doors one last time, knowing my father was safe, and decided that my old life was officially dead. I walked down the quiet, sterile corridor toward the exit, the glass doors sliding open to reveal the cool night air of the city. I breathed in deeply, the fresh air filling my lungs for the first time in hours, and walked away into the dark, leaving behind the man who had begged for love, and stepping into a future where I would never let anyone make me second best again. The recovery ward was quieter than the emergency wing, a place where the loud sirens and frantic shouting of the trauma bay were replaced by the rhythmic beep of monitors and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes. I sat by my father's bedside, holding his cold, limp hand as he lay in a deep, medically induced sleep. My mother had finally fallen asleep on the small cot in the corner, her face worn with exhaustion and the heavy burden of the past 12 hours. As I watched the heart monitor trace a steady, slow wave, the door to the room creaked open, and a young woman in light blue scrubs stepped inside. She had long black hair tied back in a neat ponytail, warm green eyes that seemed to carry an innate understanding of the weight in the room, and a gentle presence that immediately quieted the noise in my mind. She checked the 4-drip, adjusted the blankets around my father, and then looked at me with a soft, understanding smile that didn't demand anything in return. "You've been here all night, haven't you?" she asked, her voice a quiet murmur that didn't disturb the sleeping patients. I nodded slowly, my voice scratchy and dry as I replied that I couldn't leave him until I knew he was stable. She introduced herself as Eliza, one of the ICU nurses on the morning shift, and without another word, she stepped out of the room, returning a few minutes later with a warm cup of coffee and a small bottle of water. She handed them to me, her hand brushing mine with a brief, comforting warmth that felt entirely foreign after years of Elena's cold detachment. You need to take care of yourself if you want to take care of him, Liam, she said softly, sitting on the edge of the adjacent empty bed to explain my father's recovery steps. She didn't use complicated medical jargon, instead, she explained the healing process with a patience and clarity that made the terrifying monitor screens seem manageable. For the next hour, Eliza walked me through the medication schedule, the signs of recovery to look out for, and what to expect when my father woke up. She stayed past the end of her shift, ignoring her colleagues' calls to the break room, just to make sure I understood the care my father would need in the coming weeks. Her dedication was quiet, a steady and unpretentious devotion to her work that contrasted sharply with Elena's performative affection, which was always designed for an audience. I watched Eliza adjust the monitors, her movements efficient and gentle, and felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation in my chest, a sense of safety, of being supported by someone who didn't expect a reward or a toast in return. When she finally prepared to leave, she checked my father's vitals one last time and looked at me, her green eyes bright with encouragement. "He's a fighter, Liam," she said, her voice filled with a genuine sincerity that made me believe her. "And he's lucky to have a son who stands by him like you do." After Eliza left, the hospital room felt less cold, the sterile walls less imposing than they had only hours before. I took a sip of the warm coffee she had brought, feeling the heat spread through my chest, and looked at my father's calm face. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel the suffocating pressure of an impending crisis, the constant anxiety of a relationship where I was always waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. I was surrounded by the quiet support of my mother and the unexpected kindness of a stranger who had shown me more care in an hour than my fiancée had in months. The realization was a quiet revelation, a seed of peace planted in the middle of a storm. I leaned back in my chair, watching my father's chest rise and fall in a steady rhythm, and let myself breathe, knowing that the path ahead would be long and difficult, but that I was finally walking it on my own terms. The morning sun rose over the metropolitan area, casting a bright, unforgiving light on the hangover of Sebastian's birthday party. Elena woke up in a guest room of the luxury penthouse venue, her head pounding from the cheap champagne and her phone buzzing continuously on the bedside table. She reached for it sleepily, expecting a morning message from Sebastian or a text from me apologizing for not attending his party. Instead, her screen was flooded with dozens of confused, frantic messages from wedding guests, family members, and friends who had received my group text. Her heart sank, a cold dread replacing the warm glow of the previous night's celebration as she read the words, "The wedding between Liam and Elena is cancelled." She sat up quickly, her breath catching in her throat as she tried to call my number, only to receive the cold, automated recording that the subscriber was unavailable. Panic surged through her, a wild, frantic energy that drove her out of the penthouse and into her car, driving reckless through the morning traffic toward the apartment we had shared for 2 years. She convinced herself that this was just a childish tantrum, a dramatic reaction to her ignoring my calls during the party, and that she could fix it with a few tears and a promise to make it up to me. But when she key opened the door and she stepped inside, the silence of the apartment hit her like a physical blow. The living room was empty of my books, my logistics journals, and the small wooden carvings my father had made for us. She ran to the bedroom, throwing open the closet doors, only to find my side completely empty. Not a single shirt, shoe, or tie remained on the hangers. On the kitchen counter, next to the small pot of dried lavender she had bought, lay the apartment key I had left behind, reflecting the cold morning light. As Elena stood in the kitchen, trembling with a mixture of anger and confusion, the door to the apartment opened, and a middle-aged man stepped inside holding a toolbox. Elena spun around, demanding to know who he was and what he was doing in our home, her voice sharp with panic. The man looked at her with surprise, explaining that he was the new tenant and that he had signed the lease only hours before. He told her that a quiet young man named Liam had contacted the landlord the previous night, paid the lease termination fee in full, and hired a moving crew to clear out all his belongings. "He told me to throw away anything that belonged to the previous life," the tenant said, gesturing toward a large trash bin in the hallway filled with photo albums and custom wedding decorations. "He said he wanted a clean break, and that nothing in this apartment was worth keeping." The words felt like a physical slap, a cold confirmation that I hadn't just walked out of the apartment, I had erased every trace of our 3-year history. Elena ran to the trash bin, digging through the papers, and pulled out the framed photograph of our first trip to the seaside, the glass shattered and the photo torn in half. She stared at the ruined image, her tears finally spilling over her cheeks as the reality of my departure settled into her chest. She had thought I was weak, a quiet and patient man she could always push aside because I would never have the courage to leave. Now, standing in the empty apartment with a stranger looking at her with pity, she realized how wrong she had been. I hadn't argued, I hadn't screamed, and I hadn't demanded an explanation. I had simply vanished, leaving her with the key to an empty room and the crushing weight of a cancellation she couldn't explain to anyone. Elena drove to the hospital, her hands shaking on the steering wheel as she clutched the torn photograph, her mind racing with a desperate need to find me and demand an explanation. She convinced herself that my mother was behind the cancellation, that Margaret had finally poisoned my mind against her during the stress of my father's surgery. She ran through the sliding glass doors of the lobby, her hair disheveled and her makeup smeared, looking wildly around the quiet reception area. She spotted the elevator banks and started toward them, determined to search every floor until she found my father's room and forced me to look her in the eye. But before she could reach the security desk, a cold, firm hand gripped her arm, stopping her in her tracks. She spun around, ready to shout, only to find herself staring into the icy, uncompromising eyes of my mother. Margaret stood tall, her shoulders back and her face set in a hard, expressionless mask that showed no trace of the tears she had shed the night before. She pulled Elena away from the security desk, her grip tight and unyielding as she led her toward a quiet corner of the lobby. "You have no business here, Elena," Margaret said, her voice low and sharp, a whip that cut through Elena's panic. Elena tried to pull away, her voice rising as she demanded to see me, claiming that I was her fiancé and that she had a right to know what was happening. "Fiancé?" Margaret whispered, a cold, bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You stopped being his fiancé the moment you silenced his calls while his father was dying on an operating table. You chose a party over a family in crisis, and now you want to play the worried bride? You are a parasite, Elena, and my son is finally free of you." Elena flinched, her face turning pale as she tried to defend herself, claiming that Sebastian had an emergency and that she didn't know how serious my father's condition was. "You didn't know because you didn't care," Margaret snapped, her eyes flashing with a protective fury that made Elena step back in shock. "For 3 years, Liam worked himself to the bone to give you everything you wanted, while you treated him like an afterthought. You let that boy Sebastian mock him, you let your friends look down on him, and you thought he would stay forever because he loved you. Well, love has a limit, Elena, and you crossed it last night. My husband is recovering, and my son is focusing on his family. You will not bring your toxicity into this hospital, and you will never contact my son again." Elena stared at my mother, her mouth opening and closing as she realized that the gentle, quiet family she had taken for granted had turned into an impenetrable wall. She looked past Margaret toward the elevator doors, hoping to see me walk out, but the lobby remained quiet, a sterile and indifferent space that offered her no comfort. Margaret let go of her arm, her eyes filled with a deep, permanent disgust that made Elena feel smaller than she ever had in her life. "Leave now, Elena," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a cold, quiet warning. "Before I have security throw you out of this building like the trash you left in your apartment. You are dead to us. Goodbye." With that, Margaret turned her back and walked toward the elevators, leaving Elena standing alone in the cold lobby, clutching a shattered photograph and realizing that the shield that had protected her for 3 years was gone forever. A month passed, and the rainy city across the sea began to clear, the cold winter winds giving way to the soft warmth of early spring. My father was discharged from the hospital, his recovery slow but steady under the quiet, stress-free environment we had created in my mother's small cottage on the edge of the city. I had moved my belongings into their guest room, using the refund from the wedding decorations to help pay for my father's expensive heart medications and therapy sessions. I worked my normal shifts at the logistics warehouse, but without the pressure of Elena's lifestyle, the work felt lighter, a simple routine that gave me peace. Every evening, I returned to the cottage, helped my mother cook dinner, and sat with my father on the porch, listening to him talk about his youth. The silence was no longer a threat, it was a sanctuary, a quiet space where we were healing together as a family. Eliza became a constant, quiet presence in our lives during those recovery weeks, visiting the cottage on her off days to check my father's vitals and monitor his progress. She didn't have to come, it was far beyond her duties as an ICU nurse, but she did so anyway, bringing a warm, grounding energy that my parents quickly grew to love. She would sit with my mother on the porch, showing her physical therapy exercises for my father, or help me organize the complex schedule of medications in the kitchen. She was family-oriented, grounded, and possessed a quiet dedication that made me realize what a real partnership was supposed to look like. When we worked together in the kitchen, preparing low-sodium meals for my father, we didn't need to fill the air with constant chatter, our movements were synchronized, a quiet harmony of shared purpose that felt entirely natural. I remembered a sunny afternoon when Eliza and I were sitting on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and violet. She looked at me, her green eyes bright with a quiet warmth, and asked me why I had stayed in my previous relationship for so long when it was clearly destroying me. I looked out at the garden, feeling the cool breeze on my face, and took a deep breath before replying. "I thought that if I worked hard enough, if I sacrificed enough, I could make her happy," I said softly, the words no longer carrying the pain they once had. I didn't realize that some people are like black holes, no matter how much of yourself you give them, they will always demand more. Eliza smiled, her hand resting gently on top of mine, her fingers warm and reassuring. You don't have to earn love by destroying yourself, Liam, she whispered, a simple truth that settled deep into my heart and washed away the last traces of my guilt. As the days turned into weeks, my connection with Eliza grew, built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and a quiet appreciation for the simple things in life. She didn't ask me to prove myself, didn't compare me to wealthy rivals, and didn't demand that I prioritize her social needs over my family's well-being. With her, I was simply Liam, a logistics manager who cared for his parents and valued loyalty above all else. Showing the contrast between this peaceful, genuine connection and the toxic chaos of my past made me realize how far I had come since that cold night in the hospital corridor. I was no longer running on empty, no longer chasing a mirage of happiness. I had found a real, quiet sanctuary, and I was determined to protect it from whatever storms the future might bring. The glamour of the Grand Horizon venue had vanished, replaced by the cold reality of a legal invoice that lay on Elena's kitchen table. The venue was demanding a $15,000 cancellation fee, a non-refundable penalty for canceling the booking on such short notice. Elena had spent her entire personal savings on Sebastian's elaborate birthday decorations, believing that our joint savings would cover the wedding expenses. But since I had cleared the joint account, leaving only the exact portion I had contributed from my night shifts, she was left completely broke. She stared at the invoice, her eyes wide with panic as she realized she had no way to pay the debt, and that the venue was threatening to take legal action against her. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Sebastian's number, convinced that her childhood best friend would help her cover the cost. Sebastian, I need your help, Elena sobbed into the phone, her voice cracking with desperation as she explained the cancellation fee and how she had spent her savings on his party. The venue is suing me, and I don't have the money. Can you please lend me the $15,000? I promise I'll pay you back as soon as I sell some furniture. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the sound of Sebastian's television playing in the background, before he let out a light, dismissive chuckle. Elena, that's your relationship drama, not mine, Sebastian said, his voice smooth and entirely untroubled by her tears. I didn't ask you to spend your savings on my party, and I certainly didn't ask Liam to cancel the wedding. I'm in the middle of planning my summer tour, and I can't be throwing money at your personal mistakes. You need to figure this out on your own. Elena sat frozen, the phone pressed to her ear as Sebastian's cold, indifferent words cut through her panic like ice. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This was the man she had prioritized for 3 years, the friend she had rescued from every minor crisis, even when it meant leaving her fiancé in a hospital corridor. She tried to remind him of all the times she had helped him, all the dinners she had abandoned and the holidays she had ruined to keep him happy. That was your choice, Elena, Sebastian replied, his tone growing sharp and annoyed. No one forced you to do those things. You did them because you wanted to, and you can't use that to guilt-trip me into paying your debts now. I have to go, my manager is calling. Good luck with the venue. The line went dead, leaving Elena in the silent, empty apartment, the dial tone buzzing in her ear like a mockery of her loyalty. The disappointment was a physical weight, a crushing realization that the bond she had sacrificed her relationship for was nothing but a one-way street. Sebastian had used her, enjoyed her devotion, and mocked her partner, but when she actually needed him to stand by her, he had vanished without a second thought. She looked around the quiet, dusty kitchen, seeing the empty spaces where my belongings used to be, and felt a wave of profound, suffocating regret. She had thrown away a man who worked double shifts to buy her a home, a man who had loved her quietly and patiently, all to chase the approval of a selfish narcissist who wouldn't even pay a cancellation fee. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she wept in the silence of her empty life, realizing too late that the price of her choices was a debt she would be paying for the rest of her days. 6 months later, the cherry blossom trees in the metropolitan area were in full bloom, casting a soft pink glow over the quiet streets of our neighborhood. My father, Arthur, was fully recovered, his cheeks regained their color and his strength returned under the peaceful, stress-free routine we had established. We were gathered in the cottage garden for a small family dinner, celebrating his good health and the arrival of the warm spring weather. The table was filled with simple, home-cooked food, the air filled with the gentle laughter of my parents and the quiet, comforting presence of Eliza. I looked around the table, watching Eliza laugh at a joke my father made, her black hair catching the evening light, and felt a deep, unshakable certainty in my chest. I was no longer the broken man who had sat in the hospital corridor. I had rebuilt my life, and I was ready to build a future. I stood up from the table, drawing my parents' attention, and reached into my jacket pocket to pull out a small, simple velvet box. It wasn't an extravagant diamond ring that required double shifts and debt. It was a modest, elegant silver band, selected with care and paid for with my normal warehouse earnings. I looked at Eliza, my heart beating in a steady, calm rhythm as I took her hand and knelt on the grass before her, my eyes reflecting the warmth of the garden lights. "Eliza, you came into my life during my darkest hour, and you showed me what real love, respect, and loyalty look like," I said, my voice clear and steady. "You've helped heal my family, and you've helped me find my peace. I don't want to spend another day without you. Will you marry me?" Eliza stared at me, her green eyes shimmering with tears of joy, her hand trembling in mine as a bright, beautiful smile lit up her face. "Yes, Liam." "1,000 times yes," she whispered, her voice filled with a genuine emotion that needed no spotlights or public stages to feel real. My mother clapped her hands, weeping tears of pure happiness, while my father reached over to pat my shoulder, his face lined with pride and satisfaction. I slid the silver band onto Eliza's finger, feeling her grip my hand with a warm, reassuring strength that told me I would never have to walk alone again. We embraced in the quiet garden, surrounded by the love of my parents, and I knew that this proposal was the real beginning of my life. The contrast between this moment and my past was night and day. There was no pressure to perform, no expensive venue to pay for, and no shadow of another man lingering over our joy. Eliza loved me for who I was, not for what I could buy her, and she valued the quiet, loyal life we were building together above all else. As we sat back down at the table, hand in hand, my father raised his glass in a toast, his eyes bright with emotion. "To a marriage built on real respect, mutual support, and true loyalty," he said, his voice thick with gratitude, a toast that was met with cheers and smiles from everyone. I looked at Eliza, seeing my future reflected in her warm green eyes, and felt a profound sense of gratitude for the storm that had washed away the old life to make room for this beautiful, quiet peace. The following weekend, the rainy metropolitan weather returned, a cool drizzle that washed the city streets as Eliza and I walked through a quiet home decor boutique. We were choosing curtains and light fixtures for the small apartment we had recently rented together, a place we were decorating with simple, comfortable furniture that reflected our shared taste. I held a wooden cutting board in my hands, discussing the layout of our kitchen with Eliza, who was smiling as she pointed out a set of blue ceramic mugs. We were completely absorbed in our own world, laughing at our different ideas for the living room shelves, when I felt a sudden chill in the air. I looked up toward the entrance of the store, my eyes scanning the racks of decorative pillows, and froze as my gaze locked onto a familiar figure standing near the checkout counter. It was Elena, but she looked nothing like the polished, elegant designer I had known for 3 years. Her face was pale and drawn, her clothes simple and faded, and her eyes carried a heavy, permanent exhaustion. She was holding a cheap plastic picture frame, counting out wrinkled bills from her wallet to pay the cashier, her shoulders slumped in a posture of quiet defeat. As she turned to leave the store, her eyes swept across the room and stopped on me, her breath catching visibly in her throat as she recognized my face. She took a step toward us, the plastic frame slipping from her hand and clattering onto the wooden floor as she stared at me and Eliza. She looked at our joined hands, looked at the simple silver ring on Eliza's finger, and felt a wave of cold shock wash over her face. Elena walked over slowly, her eyes fixed on my face with a mixture of disbelief, pain, and a desperate, lingering hope that made my stomach turn. "Liam," she whispered, her voice shaking as she stopped a few feet away, completely ignoring Eliza's presence. "Is it really you? I've been trying to find you for months. I called your mother, I went to your warehouse, but no one would tell me where you went." I looked at her calmly, my face an expressionless mask, my grip on Eliza's hand remaining steady and warm. I didn't feel angry, didn't feel the urge to shout or blame her. I felt nothing but a distant, polite indifference that seemed to shock her more than any fury would have. "Yes, Elena, it's me," I said, my voice flat and quiet, a simple statement that offered her no comfort. She looked at Eliza, seeing the genuine concern and protective warmth in her green eyes, and then looked back at me, her tears finally spilling over her pale cheeks. She saw the look in my eyes, the deep, quiet respect and love that I reserved for Eliza, a look that had once belonged to her but had now been completely erased from my memory. You canceled everything, Liam," she sobbed, her voice rising in the quiet store as she stepped closer. "You canceled the venue, you blocked my number, you left me with the debt, and you just disappeared. How could you do that to me after 3 years? How could you just erase me like I never existed?" I stood my ground, my arm resting protectively around Eliza's waist, and looked down at the woman who had once been my entire world, preparing to give her the only explanation she would ever receive. The rain outside the boutique had turned into a steady pour, the water drumming against the glass windows as we walked out into the cool parking lot. Elena followed us, refusing to let me go, her hands reaching out toward my sleeve as she begged me to talk to her, to give her a chance to explain herself. Eliza walked quietly by my side, her presence a steady anchor that kept me grounded, her hand resting on my arm to show her support. I stopped next to our car, turning around to face Elena one last time, my eyes cold and steady under the gray city sky. "Liam, please, just listen to me," Elena cried, her hair wet from the rain, her voice cracking with a desperate, agonizing regret. "I made a mistake. Sebastian used me, he wouldn't help me pay the debt, and I realized how much I threw away when I lost you. I was stupid, I was selfish, but I still love you. Can't we just talk? Can't we try to fix this? I looked at her, watching her shiver in the cold rain, and felt a profound sense of closure. The woman standing before me was a stranger, a ghost from a past life that had no power over my present. I remembered the 20 missed calls on my phone, remembered the cold beep of my father's heart monitor, and remembered the sound of her laughing at Sebastian's party while my mother wept in a dark corridor. The memory didn't hurt anymore, it was simply a fact, a historical event that had led me to the peace I now enjoyed with Eliza. There is nothing to fix, Elena, I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the sound of the rain like a bell. You made your choice 6 months ago, and I made mine. I realized that the man who begged for your attention was a fool, and I decided to leave him behind in that hospital corridor. But 3 years, Liam! Elena screamed, her shoulders shaking as she stepped closer, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate pleading. You can't just turn off your feelings like a switch. You loved me. You worked yourself to death for me. You can't just pretend that meant nothing to you. I looked down at Eliza, whose green eyes were filled with a quiet confidence and a deep, unwavering trust in me, and then looked back at Elena. You turned off your phone when my father was dying, Elena, I replied, my voice dropping to a slow, cold whisper that made her freeze in her tracks. You decided that a birthday party and Sebastian's caterer were more important than my family's survival. So, I did the only logical thing. I just turned off my heart to you. I closed the door, and I threw away the key. Elena stared at me, her mouth opening in a silent gasp of pain as the absolute finality of my words crashed into her chest like a physical blow. She realized then that there was no negotiation, no amount of tears or excuses that could ever bridge the chasm she had created between us. She was completely, permanently erased from my life, left behind in the rain with the debt of her choices and the memory of a love she had thrown away for nothing. I turned away from her, opened the car door for Eliza, and stepped inside, leaving the ghosts of my past behind in the cold, wet parking lot. As we drove away into the quiet afternoon, Eliza reached over to hold my hand, her fingers warm and steady, and I looked forward to the road ahead, knowing that the silence of my new life was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard.